The sledgehammer crashed through the pristine blue tiles, sending fragments spinning through the morning air like shattered dreams. Sarah Chen wiped the sweat from her brow, unaware that her neighbor Karen Whitfield was recording everything from behind her rose bushes, phone trembling with rage. "That's destruction of sacred property," Karen whispered into her camera, her voice carrying the weight of ancient fury. "She has no idea what she's done." The chlorinated water began to drain, carrying with it secrets that had been buried for 70 years, secrets that would turn a simple home renovation into a battle for the very soul of Maple Grove Street. Karen's eyes gleamed with the fervor of a crusader as she dialed a number she hadn't called in decades. It's the morning sun cast long shadows across 1247 Maple Grove Street as Sarah Chen stood in her backyard, surveying the kidney-shaped pool that had dominated the space for the past 3 decades. The concrete was cracked, the filtration system ancient, and the entire structure screamed of 1990s excess. Today, it would finally go. "Are you absolutely certain about this, Mrs. Chen?" Miguel Santos, the contractor, asked as he unloaded his equipment. His weathered hands gestured toward the pool with something approaching reverence. "It's a beautiful piece of work. Could probably restore it for half the cost of removal." Sarah shook her head, her black hair catching the morning light. "My husband and I have been planning this garden for years. We want raised beds, fruit trees, maybe a greenhouse in the corner." She pointed to where the deep end currently sat. "This pool has been nothing but a money pit since we bought the house." From the neighboring yard, Karen Whitfield emerged from behind her meticulously maintained rose bushes, her silver hair perfectly coiffed despite the early hour. She wore a floral housecoat that had seen better decades, and her pale blue eyes held an intensity that made Miguel unconsciously step backward. "Sarah, dear," Karen called out, her voice carrying the saccharine sweetness that preceded her most vicious observations. "I couldn't help but notice the commotion. Surely you're not planning to disturb the pool?" Sarah turned, suppressing the familiar surge of irritation that Karen's interruptions always brought. "Good morning, Karen. Yes, we are finally getting rid of it." Karen's hand flew to her throat, clutching the strand of pearls she wore even while gardening. "But you can't. That pool, it's special. The water has been blessed." Miguel raised an eyebrow and exchanged a glance with his crew. Sarah forced a polite smile. "I'm sorry, Karen, but blessed or not, it's got to go. We've already pulled the permits." "Permits?" Karen's voice rose an octave. What permits could possibly authorize the destruction of sacred water? "The kind issued by the city planning department," Sarah replied, her patience already wearing thin. "Look, I know you're attached to the neighborhood's history, but this is my property." Karen's expression shifted, the polite mask slipping to reveal something harder underneath. "You don't understand what you're dealing with, Sarah. This isn't just about property lines or city permits. There are older laws at work here." Sarah stared at her neighbor, wondering if the summer heat was already getting to the elderly woman. "Older laws?" "The pool was installed in 1995, Karen said, stepping closer to the chain-link fence that separated their properties. "But the site has been sacred for much longer than that." Miguel cleared his throat. We've got a job to do here. If you don't mind." "I mind very much," Karen snapped, her attention pivoting to the contractor with laser focus. "And you would mind too, if you knew what you were about to destroy." Sarah had heard enough. "Karen, I appreciate your concern, but we are doing this today. The equipment is here, the crew is here, and frankly, I've been looking forward to this. 4 months. "You'll regret this," Karen said quietly, backing away from the fence. "Mark my words, Sarah Chen. Some things are meant to remain undisturbed." As Karen retreated to her house, Sarah felt a chill despite the warming morning air. She'd lived next to Karen Whitfield for 8 years, and while the woman was undeniably eccentric, there had been something different in her voice just now. Something that sounded less like neighborhood busybody and more like genuine warning. "Don't mind her," Miguel said, but Sarah noticed he was watching Karen's house with wariness. Old neighborhoods, they've got their characters. Ready to begin. Sarah nodded, pushing aside her unease. "Let's do this." The first blow of the sledgehammer against the pool's coping sent a satisfying crack echoing through the morning air. Sarah had insisted on taking the first swing herself, and the vibration up her arms felt like liberation. Years of maintenance, cleaning, and worry about liability were about to end with each strike. "Feels good, doesn't it?" Miguel called out, as Sarah handed him the hammer. "Better than therapy," she replied, surprising herself with how much she meant it. The crew worked with practiced efficiency, breaking up the concrete edge and preparing to drain the remaining water. Sarah had been meticulous about the process. Chemicals neutralized, fish relocated to her sister's pond, even the old pool toys. Donated to charity. Everything by the book. Except for Karen. From her kitchen window, Sarah could see her neighbor's silhouette, perfectly still, watching every moment of the demolition. The woman hadn't moved in over an hour, and something about her vigil was beginning to unnerve Sarah more than she wanted to admit. "Mrs. Chen." Miguel's voice carried a note of concern. "You might want to see this." Sarah hurried over to where Miguel knelt beside the pool's shallow end. He'd been removing the decorative tiles when he discovered something underneath. A small metal plaque, green with age, embedded in the concrete itself. "Can you make out what it says?" Sarah asked, crouching beside him. Miguel wiped away decades of accumulated grime with a careful touch. The words that emerged made them both fall silent. "Sacred spring of the Seneca Nation, may the waters run clear, may the spirits find peace blessed by running bare." 1952. Sarah's mouth went dry. That's not possible. This house was built in 1987. The pool came later. "The plaque's definitely older than that," Miguel said, his voice subdued. "Look at the corrosion pattern. This has been here for decades." A slow clap echoed from Karen's yard. Both Sarah and Miguel turned to see their neighbor standing at her back door, applauding with deliberate, mocking rhythm. "Congratulations," Karen called out. "You've just discovered what I've been trying to tell you. That pool wasn't built on empty ground, Sarah. It was built over a sacred spring." Sarah stood up, brushing dirt from her knees. "Even if that's true, and I'm not saying it is, the pool is still on my property." "Property that was stolen," Karen replied, her voice carrying across the yards with perfect clarity. "Property that was taken from people who had blessed those waters for generations." Miguel was studying the plaque more carefully now, using his phone's flashlight to illuminate the details. "Mrs. Chen, there's more text here. It's in another language, but underneath the English, it says something about a covenant." Sarah felt a growing knot in her stomach. "What kind of covenant?" "I can't make it all out, but it mentions protection and consequences for those who disturb the sacred waters." Karen had moved closer to the fence, her eyes bright with something that looked disturbingly like anticipation. The Seneca blessed this spring in 1952, after the government forced them from their ancestral lands. Running Bear was a medicine man who understood that the waters here had power. He made an agreement with the first families who moved to Maple Grove Street. "What kind of agreement?" Sarah asked, despite herself. "Protection for reverence," Karen said simply. "The waters would bring blessing to those who honored them, and..." She paused, her smile turning predatory. "Well, let's just say the consequences for desecration were made very clear." Miguel had gone very quiet, his attention fixed on something at the bottom of the drained pool. "Mrs. Chen, you need to see this." Sarah climbed down into the empty pool, her sneakers squeaking against the wet concrete. Miguel was pointing to a section of the pool floor where the concrete appeared different, older, rougher, as if it had been poured at a different time. "This isn't original to the pool construction," Miguel said. "Someone built over something that was already here." Using his pry bar, Miguel carefully worked at the edge of the newer concrete. It gave way more easily than expected, revealing a hollow space underneath. Sarah peered into the opening and gasped. Below the pool floor, accessible through what appeared to be a deliberately constructed access point, was a natural stone basin. Clear water bubbled up from an underground spring, creating a small pool that had probably existed for centuries. The water was pristine, almost luminous in the dim light filtering down from above. "Jesus," Miguel whispered. "It's a real spring." Sarah stared at the discovery, her mind racing. The pool had been built directly over a natural spring, not just built over it, but deliberately designed to hide it while keeping it accessible. Someone had known exactly what they were doing. "My God," Karen's voice drifted down from above. She was leaning over the fence, looking into the pool with an expression of profound satisfaction. You've found it. The sacred spring of running. Bear. Sarah looked up at her neighbor with new understanding. You knew. You knew it was. Ra was in her kitchen, nursing her third cup of coffee and staring out at the violated pool, when a pristine white sedan pulled up to Karen's curb. An elderly man emerged, moving with the careful precision of someone who had learned to navigate the world despite failing eyesight. He carried a leather satchel that looked older than Sarah herself. Within the hour, 2 more cars had joined the first. Sarah watched through her window as Karen greeted each arrival with the solemnity of a funeral director, gesturing towards Sarah's backyard and speaking in hushed, urgent tones. The doorbell rang at 12:47 p.m. Sarah opened her front door to find Karen flanked by 5 of the most serious-looking elderly people she'd ever encountered. The man with the leather satchel stood slightly forward from the group, his clouded eyes somehow still managing to convey stern disapproval. Sarah Chen, Karen said formally, I'd like you to meet the Covenant Council of Maple Grove Street. Sarah blinked. The what now? The man with the satchel stepped forward. Ms. Chen, I'm Harold Zimmerman. I've been the keeper of the Covenant documentation since 1982, when my father passed the responsibility to me. His voice carried the weight of decades. We need to discuss what you've done. What I've done is renovate my own property, Sarah replied, though she could hear the defensiveness in her voice. A woman with steel-grey hair and bifocals spoke up. Property that comes with certain obligations. I'm Dorothy Blackwood. My grandmother was one of the original signatories to Running Bear's agreement. Sarah looked from face to face, seeing variations of the same expression, disappointment mixed with something that looked disturbingly like pity. Could we perhaps continue this conversation inside? Harold asked. What we have to discuss is best kept private. Against her better judgment, Sarah found herself stepping aside to let them enter. They moved through her home with surprising familiarity, as if they'd been here before, finally settling in her living room with the practiced ease of people accustomed to conducting serious business. Harold opened his leather satchel and withdrew a manila folder thick with papers. Ms. Chen, when you purchased this property in 2016, did your real estate agent mention anything about historical restrictions or covenants? No, Sarah said. Then hesitated. Well, there was something about the Homeowners Association, but not the HOA, Dorothy interrupted. The spiritual covenant. The sacred trust that has protected this neighborhood for over 70 years. Harold spread several documents across Sarah's coffee table. Even from a distance, she could see they were old, the paper yellowed, the ink faded but still legible. This is the original agreement, signed in 1952, Harold said, pointing to a document covered in both English and what appeared to be Native American script. Running Bear, medicine man of the Seneca Nation, blessed the sacred spring on your property in exchange for a binding promise from the first residents of Maple Grove Street. Sarah leaned forward to examine the papers. The signatures at the bottom included names she recognized from street signs and local landmarks. What kind of promise? A thin man with a pronounced tremor in his hands spoke for the first time. Protection for reverence. We agreed to protect the sacred waters, to ensure they remained undisturbed and honored. In return, Running Bear promised that the spirits of the land would bring prosperity and peace to our families. And it worked, added a woman with kind eyes but an unyielding expression. For 70 years, Maple Grove Street has been one of the most stable, prosperous neighborhoods in the city. Property values have never declined. Crime is virtually non-existent. Even during the worst economic downturns, our families have thrived. Sarah felt a chill of recognition. It was true. When she and David had been house hunting, their realtor had mentioned how unusual it was to find such a consistently successful neighborhood. Property values that only went up, schools that consistently outperformed expectations, a community where people seemed genuinely happy. But that protection comes with a price, Harold continued. Each property owner must acknowledge and honor the covenant. They must ensure that the sacred waters remain undisturbed. Well, I wasn't told about any of this, Sarah protested. How was I supposed to know? Dorothy reached into her purse and pulled out a thick envelope. Because every property owner receives this within 30 days of purchase. It contains copies of all the covenant documents, along with a detailed explanation of the responsibilities involved. She handed the envelope to Sarah, who stared at her own address written in Karen's familiar handwriting. The postmark was from September 2016, just weeks after they'd moved in. "I never got this," Sarah said quietly. "The postal service shows it as delivered," Karen said, speaking for the first time since the introductions. "Perhaps you were busy with the move." Sarah's mind raced. September 2016 had been chaotic. David starting his new job, unpacking boxes, dealing with the previous owner's mess. Mail had been hit or miss for weeks as the postal service adjusted to their presence. It was entirely possible that an envelope like this had been lost in the shuffle. But more likely, she realized with growing dread, it had been David who'd received it. David, who handled all their official correspondence. David, who might have dismissed it as neighborhood nonsense and never mentioned it to her. David, who had been dead for 8 months and couldn't answer her questions. "Even if I had received this," Sarah said, fighting to keep her voice steady, "I wouldn't have taken it seriously. Sacred springs, spiritual covenants, it sounds like something out of a fantasy novel." The man with the tremor leaned forward. "Ms. Chen, I'm Richard Walsh. I'm 83 years old, and I've lived on this street since I was 12. I've seen what happens to people who break the covenant." "Such as?" Richard's eyes grew distant. "The Hendersons, 1987. They tried to fill in the spring to build a tennis court. Within 6 months, Jim Henderson lost his job, their son was arrested for drug possession, and their house developed a mold problem that eventually forced them to sell at a significant loss." Sarah felt her skepticism warring with a growing unease. "Coincidence?" "The Patels, 1998, Dorothy continued. They wanted to install a swimming pool over the spring, not covering it, but they insisted on using chlorinated water. The first summer, their daughter nearly drowned in their own pool. The second summer, their business partner embezzled their life savings. They moved away before the third summer." "And the Kowalskis, 2009, Harold added grimly. "They were convinced. The spring was unsanitary and tried to have it sealed by the health department. The inspector who came to evaluate it died of a heart attack on their property. Mrs. Kowalski developed early-onset dementia within the year. Mr. Kowalski, well, let's just say he chose not to continue the fight." Sarah stared at the documents. Spread across her table, her rational mind rejecting what she was hearing while a deeper part of her began to recognize a pattern she didn't want to acknowledge. "You're trying to scare me," she said. "We are trying to save you," Karen replied. "Sarah, you've already broken the covenant by attempting to destroy the pool. But the real violation won't occur until the spring itself is disturbed or the access to it is permanently blocked." Harold nodded gravely. "There's still time to make this right. The excavation must be completed, but not to destroy, to restore. The spring must be revealed and properly honored." "And if I refuse?" The room fell. Silent. Sarah could hear the tick of her mantel clock, the distant hum of traffic, the sound of her own heartbeat. Finally, Dorothy spoke. "Then you'll learn what the others learned. The spirits of the land don't differentiate between ignorance and malice. Sarah, they only recognize honor and dishonor." Sarah stood up abruptly, pacing to the window that overlooked her backyard. The broken pool looked like a wound in the earth, and the spring at its bottom sparkled in the afternoon sun like an accusatory eye. "This is insane," she muttered. "I'm supposed to turn my backyard into some kind of shrine because of a 70-year-old agreement I never signed." "Not a shrine," Harold said gently. "A garden. The covenant specifies that the sacred waters should be accessible and honored, but it doesn't require any particular form of worship. Many families have created beautiful meditation gardens around. They're portion of the spring network." Sarah turned back to face them. "Network." Karen's expression grew cautious. "Did you think your property was the only one? Sarah, the sacred waters run beneath this entire neighborhood. Every house on Maple Grove Street, and several on the adjacent blocks, sits above some portion of the underground spring system." The implications hit Sarah like a physical blow. "You're telling me that every property owner on this street is part of this covenant?" 47 families, Richard confirmed. "All bound by the same agreement. All committed to protecting. What running bear blessed." Sarah sank back into her chair, overwhelmed. "And you all just go along with it?" Dorothy smiled for the first time since arriving. "Sarah, Look around this neighborhood. Really look. How many foreclosures have you seen? How many divorces? How many families torn apart by addiction or violence or financial ruin? Sarah had to admit she couldn't think of any. In 8 years of living here, the most dramatic event she could recall was Mrs. Patterson's cat getting stuck in a tree. The covenant works, Harold said simply. We honor the sacker. Every time she closed her eyes, she could hear the humming from the backyard growing louder, more insistent. By 3 a.m., she gave up pretending and made her way to the kitchen window. The spring glowed faintly in the moonlight, and she could swear. She saw shapes moving in the water, not fish, but something else entirely. At 6:47 a.m., her phone rang. Sarah. It's Janet from the planning department. The voice was tight with confusion. I'm calling about your pool removal permit. We've had some unusual inquiries about your project. Sarah gripped the phone tighter. What kind of inquiries? Well, the Historical Preservation Society filed an emergency petition claiming your property contains significant archaeological features. The Native American Cultural Heritage Commission submitted a formal objection. And somehow the EPA got involved. They're claiming potential groundwater contamination issues. Sarah's heart sank. What does that mean for my permit? It means it's been suspended pending a full investigation. Sarah, I've been doing this job for 15 years, and I've never seen anything like this. How did your pool removal become an environmental and cultural incident overnight? After hanging up, Sarah stared at her coffee growing cold. The covenant. Keepers worked fast, or maybe the spirits did. Either way, her legal avenue for finishing the demolition had just vanished. The doorbell rang at 8 a.m. sharp. Sarah opened the door expecting to find Karen or Harold, but instead faced a young man in a city inspector's uniform who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Ms. Chen. I'm Tony Castellano from Code Enforcement. I'm here about a complaint regarding unauthorized excavation of potentially contaminated soil. Contaminated. Sarah stepped aside to let him in, noting how his eyes darted nervously around her house. By what? I'll be honest with you. This is the weirdest complaint I've ever received. The caller claimed you've exposed an underground water source that could pose public health risks, but when I asked for specifics, they started talking about spiritual contamination and angry spirits. Tony pulled out a tablet and stylus. Normally, I'd dismiss something like that, but the caller provided your exact address, detailed photos of the excavation, and somehow knew the precise depth and location of your water table. So here I am. Sarah led him to the backyard, where Tony spent 10 minutes photographing the broken pool and the exposed spring. His professional demeanor gradually gave way to genuine puzzlement. This is actually pretty interesting, he admitted, crouching beside the spring. The water's incredibly clear. Temperature feels consistent, and the flow rate suggests this is fed by a substantial underground source. He pulled out a digital pH meter and tested the water. Balanced. Clean. Actually, this is some of the purest natural water I've seen in the city. So there's no contamination. Tony shook his head. Not that I can detect. But Ms. Chen, you've got a bigger problem. This spring appears to be connected to the city's groundwater system. Any major disruption could affect water quality for the entire neighborhood. You'll need permits from the Water Resources Department, Environmental Services, and probably the County Health Board before you can proceed with any changes. Sarah felt the walls closing in. How long does that process take? 6 months minimum. Maybe a year if there are complications. Tony packed up his equipment, then paused. Can I ask you something off the record? Sure. Have you noticed anything unusual since you started this project? I mean besides the permit issues. Sarah studied his face. Like what? Tony glanced around as if checking for eavesdroppers. The woman who filed the complaint, she, was very specific about timing. She said you had until sunset today to make things right, or there would be consequences. When I asked what kind of consequences, she said I'd find out soon enough if you didn't listen. A chill ran down Sarah's spine. What woman? Didn't give her name. But she knew details about this property that aren't in any city records. Things about the previous owners, the original construction, even the exact mineral content of your spring water. Tony shook his head. 15 years in this job, and I've never had anyone call in a complaint who knew more about a property than the owner. After Tony left, Sarah found herself pacing her house like a caged animal. Every official avenue for completing her renovation had been systematically blocked. The Covenant Keepers had managed to mobilize city government, environmental agencies, and cultural preservation groups overnight. At 10 a.m., her sister Lisa called. "Sarah, are you okay? I had the strangest dream about you last night." "What kind of dream?" "You were standing in water up to your knees, and there were people all around you speaking in a language I didn't recognize. They seemed angry, really angry, and you kept trying to explain something, but they wouldn't listen." Sarah's hands began to shake. Lisa lived 3 states away and knew nothing about the pool or the spring. "Lisa, have you been talking to anyone about me recently? Any of the neighbors, maybe?" "No, why would I?" "Sarah, you're scaring me. What's going on?" Before Sarah could answer, her doorbell rang again. Through the peephole, she saw Rebecca running bare standing alone on a porch. "Lisa, I have to go. I'll call you back." Rebecca entered without waiting for an invitation, her presence immediately making Sarah's living room feel smaller and more charged with tension. "You've had an eventful morning," Rebecca observed. "The spirits are busy." The spirits called in city inspectors. Rebecca's smile was enigmatic. "The spirits work through many channels, Ms. Chen. They're quite resourceful when they need to be." Sarah gestured toward the couch, but Rebecca remained standing, moving instead to the window, overlooking the backyard. "You have until sunset," Rebecca said without preamble. 6 hours and 37 minutes, to be exact. "I thought you should understand what happens if you continue to refuse the covenant." "I'm listening." Rebecca turned from the window, and Sarah was struck again by the depth in her eyes, as if she were looking not just at Sarah, but through her, into her past and future simultaneously. "The spirits of the land are patient, but they are not passive. For 70 years, they've maintained their side of the agreement. They've protected the families of Maple Grove Street, ensured prosperity, prevented disasters. They've been faithful guardians. And if I don't restore the spring, then they'll withdraw their protection. Not just from you, but from everyone on this street. 47 families will suddenly find themselves vulnerable to every misfortune they've been shielded from for 7 decades. Sarah felt sick. That's not fair. The other families didn't break the covenant. Collective responsibility was part of the original agreement. Each family pledged to ensure that all future residents would honor the covenant. They've failed in that duty by allowing you to remain ignorant of your obligations. Rebecca moved closer, and Sarah caught a scent like sage and morning rain. But the spirits are not cruel. They're offering you a choice that honors both justice and mercy. Which is, restore the spring properly, and the protection continues. Refuse, and you'll bear the full weight of 70 years' worth of accumulated spiritual debt, not just your own consequences, but those that would have befallen every family on this street if not for the covenant's protection. Sarah staggered backward. That's impossible. No one could survive that kind of concentrated misfortune. No, Rebecca agreed quietly. They couldn't. The room fell silent except for the tick of Sarah's mantel clock. Outside, clouds had gathered despite the morning's clear skies, casting the backyard in premature twilight. "There's something else," Rebecca continued. "Something the Covenant Council didn't tell you because they hoped it wouldn't be necessary." Sarah's voice came out as a whisper. "What?" "Your husband knew about the covenant." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. "That's not possible." Rebecca reached into her jacket and pulled out a manila envelope. David Chen received the covenant documentation in September 2016, just as the council said. But he also responded to it. She handed Sarah the envelope. Inside was a letter in David's familiar handwriting, dated October 15, 2016. "Dear Covenant Council, thank you for the information about the Sacred Spring and the Neighborhood Agreement. While I find the historical aspects fascinating, I must respectfully decline to participate in what appears to be a form of organized superstition. My wife and I purchased this property in good faith, and we intend to use it as we see fit, within all applicable laws and regulations. We will not be bound by agreements we never signed, regardless of their claimed spiritual significance. If there are legitimate historical or environmental concerns about our property, please direct them through appropriate governmental channels. Sincerely, David Chen. Sarah read the letter twice, her hands trembling. He never told me. He was protecting you, Rebecca said gently. David thought he could handle the consequences himself. He didn't realize that the spiritual debt would accumulate until his death, then transfer to the next property owner. Transfer to me. Transfer to you. Sarah sank into her chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she was learning. David's cancer, which had seemed so random, so unfair, had it been punishment for breaking the covenant? Had his death been the price of his refusal to honor the agreement? I can see what you're thinking, Rebecca said. But David's illness began before. You moved here. The SP